Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Preparing for College. So excited. We have our guest today, Dr. Kelly Frindell, and she's going to be talking to us about test prep and what we need to know about it. The good, the bad, the exams, the test optional, test blind, everything going on in the test prep world. Dr. Frindell is from InHouse Test Prep. She has 20 years of experience in the field, has a passion for what she does, and I'm so excited for the conversation today. Welcome, Kelly. Do you prefer Kelly or Dr. Kelly?
Either one's fine. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. So I know in the work that I do on the financial side of business, people are always coming to me and they're saying, well, it's test optional, so we don't need to take the test. And that scares me. I mean, I know that there could be like merit money at stake, but you're the expert in this area. So, everyone should know about test prep.
Yes. And I have a lot of parents coming to me saying the same thing. They're like, oh, it's optional. Well, why would we spend time doing it? And the kids are like, yay, I don't have to do it. Because of course they don't want to. And what parents are missing is that there is a lot of nuance to this test optional business that's been happening the past few years. And historically, what has happened before the pandemic, there were some colleges that legitimately were test optional, and you could choose whether you wanted to submit your scores or not. And they really meant it, and it didn't penalize you in any way to not submit your scores. It didn't hurt you. And then once the pandemic started, pretty much the first year of the pandemic, almost all schools went to test optional overnight because all of the tests were canceled. You couldn't take the test. A few schools never did. The Florida schools never stopped requiring test scores. And some of those decisions, some of those lasted just for the first year. Some of the schools said, we're going to try a 3-year experiment and then decide what to do. And some of the schools have gone back to requiring tests. And some of the tests that are currently still test optional, we're getting to the end of that 3-year period already. And so some of them are going to be making decisions. And although I don't deal much with the admission side of things, I do mainly just the test prep part of it. I've been talking with a lot of educational consultants in the past few months, and what they've told me is that some of the schools that say they're test optional, it's kind of really a name only, that if you look at their statistics that are starting to come out, the majority of people who are getting accepted do have test scores, and the number of people that they're taking without them is much smaller. And there is also the issue of merit aid that you brought up just a moment ago, that some of the schools, even if they are test optional, a lot of the merit aid that you get based on your grades or your scores are based on test scores, or that's part of it. And so I had a student the other day who qualified for a Bright Futures scholarship in Florida, which provides full tuition for in-state tuition. And that was based solely on his test score. He needed a 1330. He got exactly a 1330, and that will pay his tuition for 4 years. That's a big deal. And he wouldn't have gotten it without those test scores. And so what's important for parents to know is just hearing that it's optional doesn't necessarily mean that it's in your child's best interest to not take it.
Right. I mean, there's test optional, there's test blind.
Correct.
And I don't think parents are aware of that and what the differences are. Test blind, the schools really don't want to see the grades at all.
And they cannot take test scores. And so in the University of California school system, there was a lawsuit. In the past couple of years, it was decided last year that basically that they cannot use SAT or ACT in their admissions decision. And so those schools are test blind, which means they literally cannot look at your scores. And that's different from the schools that are test optional, where you can choose to send them or not. And then some schools still just require them full stop with no nuance to it.
Right. So I guess test optional, my takeaway is certainly still study, still take them, still move forward. And in the worst case scenario, and tell me if you agree, if the grades aren't good, then maybe you don't submit.
Yes. And that's what I encourage everybody to do, is at least take it once. If you're not going to take it, at least take a practice test. That's what I typically have my students do when they come to me. I have them take a practice SAT and ACT, both to see which test might be better to prepare for, and also to give me kind of an idea of where they're at. And if they're a very, very, very low score, it may not be worth it to spend the time to put into test prep. For everybody else, it generally is. And so if you are kind of in the middle 50th percentile. That's what I've been hearing from the educational consultants I've been speaking with of a school's test range. It probably is to your benefit to submit scores, but I would check first before just assuming that you don't have to do it. And so I do encourage parents to have their children at least take a practice test or take a real test just once to see. And if it's a reasonable score, it's probably worth the time to prepare for it.
So you just mentioned about, taking a prep test. There's the ACTs, there's the SATs. I know parents are always, concerned, confused, which exam is going to be best for my child? How should they decide? Are they the same? Are they different? Is it any insight you can share?
Mhm. So they used to be a lot more different from each other than they are now. Over the years, they've kind of become more similar. And parents often ask me, they say, well, which schools accept which scores? And at this point in time, the schools that accept scores will take either one of them. It used to be different when I took it 20 years ago. Some schools in this part of the country did SAT and some did ACT, and it really depended, but now it doesn't matter. So that's the first part, is it doesn't matter which test your child takes. And there are some differences. The SAT has 4 sections. It has a reading section, an English section, which is grammar. It has 2 math sections. One of them you can use a calculator on, and one of them you cannot use a calculator on. And the ACT has a reading section, it has an English grammar section, it also has a math section, but you can use a calculator for all of it. And then the one main difference between them is the ACT has a science section on it, and there isn't really a similar corollary on the SAT. And the the science section is kind of interesting because it's about science, but you don't really need to know science to do it. So what they do is they give you several experiments, and the experiments can be about biology or chemistry or physics, astronomy, all kinds of science topics. But what they do is they give you some information about the experiment, they give you some data, and then they're asking you to interpret the data, to understand the experiment, to understand the scientific method. And so it's more of a data interpretation and reading section in the context of science. It's about science. For the most part, you don't need to sit down and memorize chemistry formulas or the periodic table or physics formulas. It just happens in the context of science. And that one sometimes is the sticking point for people because it is a little bit different and a little bit weird. Sometimes when people first see it, the first time people take a test, they always say to me, they go, what was that? Because it is strange, but it's learnable and coachable like all of the rest of the sections. The one other main difference between the tests is the timing. The timing on the SAT is easier than it is on the ACT, but the SAT tends to be trickier than the ACT. And so there are some trade-offs. And what I've found is that students who are good at tests are going to be good at both tests. And at least in my own practice, what I've seen is that the ones who struggle with tests a little bit more often, the ACT is a little bit easier to prepare for just because it isn't as tricky.
Oh, that's interesting. So if you have, first of all, when should somebody come in and start test prep? When should they take the exams? How do you steer them which exam to study for? Or can they study for both at the same time?
Yes to all of that. So typically I have students come in and see me. Usually people come sometime summer before junior year or fall of junior year. And typically I don't recommend much earlier. Sometimes people call me when their kids are in 8th or 9th grade to do SAT prep. And I have to say, no, it's too early, call me in 3 years. And there's really no reason to start specific prep that early because you're going to burn your kid out. There isn't enough material to work for 3 or 4 years. And the tests change over time. And in fact, the SAT is going digital next year, in 2024. And so if you started preparing too early, you'd be preparing for a test that isn't even going to exist by the time your kid starts. So typically sometime around junior year, I personally like to have my students take a first test by the end of fall of their junior year. So by December of junior year, I like kids to have taken something. And that gives plenty of time to take a second test or to take the other test or do whatever you need. And I always like to plan with a little bit of extra padding in there because you never know what's going to happen. People get sick. We've got sports tournaments and musicals and pandemics and tests get canceled and you just never know. So I like to leave a little bit more room. You do technically have up until about September or sometimes October of your senior year to be done with the test, depending on what schools you're applying to and when the applications are due. But I really want my students to not have to deal with it their senior year because there's so much else going on. They're dealing with their classes, they're writing their applications, they're probably going on college visits, and then all the regular school things. So ideally, if you can get it done by the summer of your senior year, that's what I recommend. But technically, you have a little bit later to do it. And when students come to me, typically what I do is I have them take a practice test first. And sometimes it's very clear which test
So,
is going to be better.
so
Yes,
is
go
that
ahead.
practice test specific to one or the other? Or is this
Yes,
your
so
own?
I give them a specific SAT test and a specific ACT
Oh,
test, and they're
okay.
official tests that the test makers put out, and you can find those easily on the internet. And they're good ones to use because it's official material, and official just means it comes from the test makers, and that's always the best material to use because it's exactly right. And if you use materials from companies the big test prep companies, the material is never quite right. It's close, but there are some subtle differences, and it's not anything the kids could pick out, but I've done it so long I can look at it and go, that math problem is about a half a step too hard. They've gone too far into it, or this topic is not even tested, or they've gone about this the wrong way. So those official tests are good to use as practice tests. And that's something the kids can do just at home. They don't have to go anywhere. The scores don't get sent anywhere. It doesn't cost any money. And once you have the scores for those, sometimes it is very clear, okay, ACT is clearly a better test or SAT is clearly better. If they're very similar to each other, usually I'll talk with the child and see if they have some particular preference for them, because some kids will tell you straight up, they're like, I am never taking that one again. That was awful. You cannot pay me enough money to do it. And some of it depends too on personal strengths and also just things like logistics of scheduling and when they can take the test. But usually students either have a clear answer or have a clear preference for one of them. And once we decide which test they're going to take, I always have them pick a specific test date to work towards. And that to me is really important because if you just have this open-ended period of you're going to take the test sometime next spring, it loses its urgency and kids will not prepare for it. There are a few who will, but most people will not because they've got other things going on. It's not that interesting to them and they're stressed and they're doing other things. So we pick a date and then we work backwards to decide when to start preparing because I want to make sure that we are preparing up until that test rather than preparing and then waiting and then taking it.
So what, in your opinion, is like the ideal amount of study time?
That really depends on the student. What I typically see with my students, one is the kids who come into me and are pretty on top of things and don't have a lot of gaps in their basic skills. Typically, 2 to 3 months sometimes is enough. If with the kids who are lacking some skills, which lately a lot of kids are missing quite a few skills because they miss so much school, something more like 4 to 6 months might be more appropriate. And I have some people who do a little less, some people who do more, but I would plan to spend at least several months working on it.
Makes sense. And I know you like to tutor one-on-one. So how does that normally work? What does it look like? You know, how do you divide your time between the different sections? What have you found that, you know, works best?
Mhm. Yeah, so I do all one-on-one. I've considered teaching group classes, but I taught group classes when I first started. And what I found out is that the way I was taught to teach them was right down the middle. And so if the people who were very gifted were bored, and the people who struggled with tests were confused and bored, and the people in the middle were bored because it's boring to do a 3-hour test prep class. And so I do all individual sessions. And before the pandemic, I had always worked with people in person. And then once the pandemic hit, I switched to online. And sometimes I get parents who are really concerned about doing the online tutoring. They say, oh, my kid can't do it because they had this terrible Zoom school experience. And we have to do in person. And what I usually tell them is that Zoom school was a totally different experience. And that honestly, I myself could not have sat for 7.5 hours on a Zoom screen with 30 other people with somebody who was thrown into something that they didn't have the tools for in the middle of a worldwide emergency. Of course, that was awful. That would be awful for anybody. And the one-on-one tutoring for an hour is a really different experience. And since I can speak with the kids, it's very personal. We are able to interact in this pretty much in the same way that we could when I was in my office with them. And there are enough tools on Zoom to be able to accommodate working on problems. So I have a laptop with a stylus. I can pull up PDFs. I can write on them. The kids can share back on their screen. They hold up the paper sometimes to their screen when they can't, if they've had to write it down on paper. So there are all kinds of tricks and things to make that online tutoring successful. And typically what I do with my students is the first few sessions are pretty similar for all of my students. And what we're covering are some of the basic strategies for each of the different sections. So for maybe the first 4 lessons, we'll spend the first one on math, then on English, then on reading, then on science, and talking about the basic strategies so that they can start incorporating those. And then from there, we can really customize what it is that we're working on. And that's one of the benefits of one-on-one tutoring is we can do whatever your child needs to do without having to stick to a standardized curriculum. I don't have to worry about other people being bored or lost. It's just really focused on what they need. And it's a mixture of working on skills that are weak, but also working on the skills where you're likely to pick up the most points, because the point of test prep is get as many points as you can wherever you can. And there are some things that are harder to fix than others. If your child has difficulty reading, test prep is probably not going to fix that. It's not going to make them a faster reader, but what it can help them do is figure out where to spend their time, because some questions are so hard, they're not worth it for most students to spend time on. If you're trying to get that very perfect score, you have to do the hard questions. For everybody else, they should ignore the hard questions and work on the ones they're likely to get right and spend their time there, because the timing is tough. And so now I have lost my train of thought. What was your
No, but I love what you
question?
were just saying. I love the strategy.
Yes, thank you, the strategy. And so that's part of what we're picking out is what to answer and what not to be. And that's something the kids haven't heard necessarily before, because they're used to taking tests at school where you answer everything, whether you know how to do it or not, and you don't really know which ones are harder and which ones are easier. And with the test, for the most part, you can tell where the hard questions are or which types of questions are harder. So a lot of it is just directing people, okay, don't spend time on this one, do spend time on this one, do it in this order. When you see this type of question, it tells you it's this type of thing. So there is a mixture of strategy and then also content, because we're also reviewing basic math skills, basic grammar skills, formulas, and so it's a mixture of those.
So let me ask you, and I get this question all the time, but this is a better question for you. How a parent comes to you and says, oh, my kid got such and such. Is it a good score?
Yes. So good is subjective, and it really depends on, is it good for your child and what they are needing. And so sometimes I have parents come to me and their kids are very high scores, and they might have a 1550 on the SAT, which is in the 99th percentile. And I say, oh, well, I really want them to get a 1570 or 1580 or 1590. And at that point, it doesn't really matter that much. Once you are in the 99th percentile, you have already proved that you are a good student, and the schools that you're applying to, everybody else is going to have a high score too. For those kids, if they're applying to the Harvards and the Yales and the Ivies, everybody else has a high score too, and it's no longer all that interesting to the admissions people, other than as a checkbox that, okay, yep, you're scoring in the 99th percentile. And so for those students, I often tell them, if they're trying to go from a 1550 to a 1570, often that is not worth spending time on, because you've already proven that you're a good test taker. You've checked that box, and go move on and do other things that will help you. Go volunteer, play a sport, or do an activity, or work on your studies, whatever. For other students, and that's only a very small percentage of people, because those are the very top students. For everybody else, which is most of everybody else, it does really depend on what kind of schools you're looking at and where their score ranges. And those score ranges are available publicly. If you just Google the name of your school and SAT scores or ACT scores, it will give you responses about the middle 50th percentile. Sometimes they report it as 25th, 75th percentile, and you can kind of extrapolate where your score would fall in there. And from what I have heard from the consultants, if you are nearest to the 50th percentile, it's worth submitting your score for those. And so there you can't pass or fail the SAT or ACT. You can just get a percentile rank of how you did compared to other students. And for comparison for that, 50th percentile for SAT is right around 1,000, and SAT is out of 1,600. And 50th percentile on the ACT, it's always been right at about a 20, but I just saw an article came out yesterday and it said that ACT scores were the lowest they've been in 30 years, and the national average was a 19 point something. It was the first time in 30 years
Did they
it had
attribute
fallen
it to
below
the
a 20.
pandemic?
Yes, because there's been so much learning loss, and
Wow.
and also some of the kids have selectively opted out of taking the test. A whole lot of those middle level kids have opted out, and they didn't address that in the article, but I'm sure that has to be part of it too. You have a huge chunk of the country not taking the test that used to take it, but 20 has historically been 50th percentile for ACT. And that kind of gives some parameters for helping people see, okay, is my kid in the top half or the bottom half, and give some good information.
Fabulous. I'm so glad that you were able to come in and share all this information today. Do me a favor, share with everybody how they can find you online, how they can reach out to you, how they can start preparing and, have their children start preparing for exams.
Yes, so my website and my business is called InHouse Test Prep. The website is www.inhouse, INHOUSE, testprep, all one word.com. And on my website, I've got a free parents guide for SAT and ACT that you can download. There's a link to schedule a call if you're interested in more information. And then I also have up some blog posts about test prep in general.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you so much. So glad that you were with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
This was lots of fun. And hopefully everybody's going to start preparing for tests and making sure that their kids take their exams, even if the kids complain, because it'll benefit them in more ways than one. Anyway, thanks again and have a good day. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.